I personally don't get why people complain about planning combat for their campaign so often. It doesn't take me that long. And I don't really have any problems with CR or combat balance, and that's because I, more or less, completely ignore it. And trust me, I'm not crazy. I do use it as like a rough basis for my encounter design. But if you've seen my discussion with Ryan over at Verdigris Table, you'll know that I've alluded to the fact that I run kind of weird combat by D&D standards. I think the words I chose for what I do were fake combat. So let me show you how to make combat significantly less tedious to run by faking it till you're making it. So what do I mean when I say that my combat is fake? I don't mean that I just wing it, or that nothing that I'm doing is rooted in the reality of combat design at all. It's just that I don't really spend time for vast majority of my combats doing anything more than glancing at a stat block for inspiration. I run almost every combat on the fly. And naturally, there are exceptions. I'll put more time into making stat blocks and planning things that I know are going to be big capstone battles, but by and large, when I say that my combat is fake, I'm referring to the fact that I base my combat almost entirely on vibes. So I'm going to break down what goes into my combat design, and then at the end I'll do a little demo on how I might build one of these encounters out. So Anto of Icarus Games recently made a really great video on how D&D encounter building isn't broken, and he's right. Most DMs are using CR incorrectly. So absolutely go check out his video, I'll link to it below. Because if you're someone who gets really frustrated by all of this stuff, I think it's important to understand that CR and XP aren't meaningless like some people suggest. Like, there's actual planning and math equations that go into playtesting all of this stuff. I just don't want to do that. And so, I don't. But at the same time, we are kind of also using all of this stuff that Anto's talking about when we think about the vibes we want our battles to have. A hard battle is gonna look different for a party that just finished a long rest versus one who's already had 2 battles today or used up resources like spell slots in a social encounter. Additionally, I don't only think about how difficult I want a battle to be when I start planning my session, and this will probably be its own video at some point, but I almost never run battle that's just go kill things. In fact, some of my groups can go several sessions without seeing combat. It all kind of depends on how they're approaching problems and choosing to troubleshoot them. Because to me, combat's just one potential outcome to conflict, not necessarily conflict in its own right. So I often have combat revolving around things like both parties wanting to get an object, protecting this ward, stopping a ritual the antagonists are trying to carry out, etc. So even if the party's cornered by a pack of hungry wolves, if they lay down their packs filled with rations, that may get them out of combat if that's what they're trying to accomplish. And that can create its own host of complications without them ever having drawn swords. So the very first part of Vibes First combat design is noting party composition, deciding on the goal of combat, and then determining how difficult it should be to win this. And so for me, AC is usually just kind of close to DC's. That way I can come up with a number on the fly if I need to. Squishy minions usually get 10 because really how different is that from an 11? Especially for a weird little creature that does like 3 damage. A lot of creatures are either 14, 15, and something armored might be 17 to 19. Legendary fights can be higher than this, of course. Say if they're fighting a Tarrasque, but this is just a rough guideline. And this is the most fudgeable of the stat vibes, because it also depends on the PCs and how many of them have roll to hit attacks versus spell save ones. So if I know my players are out of spell save attacks, and this was supposed to be a medium to easy encounter, I might lower the AC of that harpy from 17 to 14 if nobody hit it on that first round. Next up is deciding the HP of the enemy. And this is usually kind of similar across the board for me. The biggest differentiator in HP is whether I want one bigger enemy like a cloud giant versus a pack of werewolves versus a mage and some minions. But someone recently reminded me that Mike Shea of Sly Flourish talks a lot about glass cannon monsters. So this is probably where I originally picked that idea up from, because the thing that makes a fight hard or scary is almost never whether or not it's a slog. It isn't spending 8 rounds having to fight the exact same thing. The scary usually comes a bit more from the next part of this, which is the damage and effects they're capable of doling out. So how much HP they have for me depends on the size of the party, the composition of the party, and how many rounds I want combat to go for. Because 3 rounds with 7 players is vastly different from 3 rounds with 3 players. And I think a lot of people usually play with 3 to 4 players, and for that I usually try to plan for easy encounters to be 2 rounds tops, and more difficult encounters are usually between 3 and 6. Again, this is really a vibes thing. What we're really trying to do here is minimize drag, but sometimes it'll make sense to have more rounds. Sometimes there are special set piece battles where it might be more fun, especially if the PCs have multiple objectives to focus in on. But again, that's where you just have to be very careful with drag and kind of make sure it still feels upbeat and fun. And so with that being said, AC, HP, damage dealt, and spell saves are probably the only roughly CR-based things I really do. And I'm gonna link to this little calculator below. It's meant for monster and encounter design, so it's kind of how I have a tendency to view this, just like the numbers that I'm meeting. But I always have kind of a rough range of HP I want them to have, and a rough range of damage I want them to deal. So at this stage, it isn't really about fleshing out their attacks. This is just the number I want to have in mind so I know what vibe I'm targeting. Whether I want it to be this hard-hitting glass cannon, or if this is a somewhat easy battle. And so a big part of making sure it doesn't drag, or go obscenely quickly if you did math wrong in the opposite direction, is to just give them this floating HP and damage range. You just want enough wiggle room on either end to extend or end battle early, so that it fits the vibe you were designing for. Next up is determining saves, which is super quick for me. I tend to pool them together so I don't have to spend that much time on this part. I group intelligence and wisdom, strength and constitution and sometimes dex, and then charisma and sometimes dex. And dex is a floating stat for me. I can't really explain why, other than sometimes it's treated like a physical skill and other times it's treated kind of more of this mental sneaky skill. So I do the same where it makes sense. And so if you have monster stat blocks that you already like and you feel like they're balanced with the encounter you're designing around, you can just take the highest modifier from each of these stat pools. The exception with this being if a creature has like a -1 modifier in intelligence and a +5 in wisdom. But I feel like it's not something I design that often or come across in the wild that often. Then you can like average it out or whatever, I don't care. Just pick one. And so I'll decide if I think this monster is really good, medium, or kind of sucks at this save, and then give them a proficiency bonus to the one I think they'd have one too. This takes like 2 seconds this way. Last but not least, we have skills, attacks, and abilities. For me, I do skills as a straight roll unless I want them to have a special ability. One of my favorite D&D related books is The Monsters Know What They're Doing by Keith Amon. I really want each individual creature to feel unique, so I care a lot about their flavor and their tactics. So sometimes if I have a giant lizard-like monster and it has blindsight and the PCs aren't engaged with it yet, I might have that monster make a perception roll to use their great sense of smell to try and suss out where the PCs or a certain object is. And so sometimes I'll just use the modifier from the save associated with that skill roll, but oftentimes I'm much more likely to just do a straight roll with advantage instead. So that's it, skills, easy peasy. But now we get to my favorite part, attacks and abilities. And so for abilities, a lot of low CR creatures don't have any abilities, or they have 1 or 2 related to communication, movement, advantage or disadvantage with a certain skill, or pack tactics. So unless I'm doing something cool with one of those, like animals that get charging attacks, or pack tactics for something we want our fighter to use battlefield control on, we'll largely ignore it in an easy to medium fight. But one of the things I like to do is keep lists of abilities that particular players were surprised by, enjoyed, maybe struggled with when they came up against them. It's just good knowledge to have. Then as we get to higher CR creatures, some of these abilities become a lot more interesting and or make combat a lot more deadly when used correctly. Abilities I'm always impressed by are the ones for Archfey in Kobold Press's Tome of Beasts series. Again, I'll link below. Overall, I think they always have some interesting creature design. It always helps get me feeling inspired, but you can see already how some of these high CR creature stat blocks get very verbose. So I usually pick a handful of potential abilities and attacks that are inspiring to me. And if you prefer more traditional monsters, with a twist that gives them more flavorful abilities, I also really enjoy using Flea Mortals for inspiration for creatures in that vein. It's from Matt Koval's line, so of course it's great. But again, I don't want to have stat blocks that are 5 pages long. Vibes First Combat Design is all about making sure that everything feels flowy, and to get out of the way of good roleplay during combat. So as we get to these higher CRs, I'll sometimes pick an ability or two that has either a way to deal additional damage, like with a situation with charge, or a roll for a save effect, maybe a healing ability. I enjoy rechargeable attacks, and then I'll usually throw in a few spells. And since we're #justvibes over here, attacks get infinitely easier to run. We use the same save formula for our attack rolls, and if you're running low CR creatures, a lot of it's going to be using just appropriate damage and make sure you're flavoring it in a fun way. So instead of saying you take 1d6 piercing damage from its claws, you can first describe how the baby griffin pounces on the forest gnome, its claws piercing into the flesh of their arms, and then tell them how much damage to mark. Make it fun. And then if you want the creature or the enemy to be able to dole out big damage, I usually give them a multi-attack. This is also where I decide whether they have spells or not, because if I want an enemy to feel dangerous and they're super smart, they're probably going to be a caster and have some range. So their physical multi-attack might not be as strong as a creature who's all brawn. And that creature who has multi-attack as kind of its main ability will have more physical damage that it can dole out. So this is one of those places where it's important to understand how the creature's attacks stack with their abilities, but also how your party composition interacts with all of this. Because sometimes you want to make things dangerous for your marshals, sometimes you want to target your casters, and sometimes you just want your party to run away from the enemy, even though we both know that's never gonna happen. And so if you need them to have the threat of big damage, but you don't necessarily want them to be at the receiving end of it every single round, I start thinking about either spreading multi-attacks over different PCs, or using attacks with saves, or attacks that have the rechargeable ability. That way the PCs don't always have to contend with it, but you know, the danger's there. Lurking. Let's design an encounter together. Here are our PCs. They're little babies, they're level 3. We have a Path of the Zealot Barbarian, a Circle of the Moon Druid, and a Grave Domain Cleric. So even without going into all of the things they might have access to, as a GM, I know the Barbarian can tank more damage. The Druid also might decide to be a little tanky if they see a lot of damage is being dealt, but also depending on what spells they have prepared and how much they really enjoy wild shaping. And then we know the Cleric probably has some healing spells prepared. So when I throw this all together, I'm going to be keeping this in mind. In this situation, the PCs have managed to sneak their way into an area they really shouldn't be, so I want this encounter to be more deadly. Kind of like in a video game where you're not supposed to be there yet. I want to try to scare them away from this area. But I do want them to have the slightest chance of winning, because I want to see what type of players they are. If they're on death's door and they push forward so that they can find out the secrets of the Baroness and her mansion, they might find themselves in trouble. So the goal of combat for them might be to neutralize the foes that are trying to stop them from entering the mansion. It also might be to outrun them, and that might be either into the mansion or away from the mansion. Again, we're testing their mettle a little here. So we have our high-level information. 3 PCs averaging higher HP if they're using certain spells and abilities, trying to get into the Baroness's mansion, but they didn't know that there were some deadly guards they're gonna have to deal with. And for this group, I'm anticipating around 4 rounds of combats, 5 tops if they're really trying to push through. So now we're gonna look at the AC HP damage for this. So for AC, we want these monsters to be relatively easy to hit, so we're gonna set it at our standard 14. HP though, this is where we're gonna have more of that range. I know I'm gonna have these enemies hit hard, so I anticipate that the Druid is gonna wild shape into a direwolf. So we're gonna have a double tank situation on our hands. But this also means the Druid is probably gonna be dealing less damage if they do this, because direwolf bites are going to be 2d6 plus 2 for them. The Barbarian has their Battle Axe, which is 1d12 plus 3, and the Cleric is our biggest wild card, because it really depends on what spells they have prepared. And that'll largely depend on whether they thought this was going to be a sneaky recon type of situation versus an adventuring day with a big fight like this. But I know they have the Toll the Dead cantrip, which is 1d12 of damage. So I'm going to imagine on the low side of damage, these creatures will be taking about 15 total damage per round, because remember, not everything hits. Sometimes you roll annoyingly low damage, and so on. So this is our more conservative side for this deadly encounter. So like I said, I imagine this being about 4 to 5 rounds if they're still standing there. So we're gonna say our low end of the HP pool for these creatures is 75. On our high end, to account for things running faster or better than we expected it was going to be for them, especially say we're wrong about what the druid's going to do, I'll estimate that that can look more like 30 damage dealt each round. Again, still a relatively conservative estimate. So the high end of our range for HP is going to be 150. And finally, we're going to be determining how hard these creatures should hit. Our barbarian's going to instantly rage, so the only thing that can really mess this up for them is if they have low initiative. But we know their HP of 35 is really closer to 70 if we're not using magic against them. Our druid has 21, but again, they wild shape into a direwolf like I'm expecting them to. That's gonna look more like 58 to 95 as their HP total. And our poor little cleric has just 24 measly hit points, but also some access to healing spells. So this overall pool is gonna look like a range of 152 to 189 HP. I anticipate our barbarian and druid being frontliners in this fight. The druid might abandon that idea once they get knocked out of wild shape for the first time, so that can change. And like I said, we're expecting this for 4 to 5 rounds. I'm mostly going to be targeting the barbarian and the druid, because to really knock down that HP, they're gonna need to hit hard to do this and make sure that they're getting across the scary factor. And so I think this means we're gonna pick 2 foes, and they're gonna each deal about 3d8 of damage each turn before modifiers. And I am going to give them a ranged attack to hit the cleric or the druid if I'm wrong about them wild shaping. And I want that to be just enough to scare them, so that's just 1d8 plus whatever modifier I'm going to be using for them. And at this point I'm really transitioning into thinking about the flavor. I'm gonna say I'm staying pretty classic fantasy for this. The old money sneaky baroness is going to have 2 very large ogres guarding her grounds. And maybe the party gets into trouble because they thought the ogres, while they were sleeping, were giant rocks or something. Maybe they didn't even see them as they came in. And if it were me, I'd definitely be thinking about getting them to roll some checks to see if they don't wake them up on the way in. I kind of like when players succeed at that and get in a little too deep, you know? I love those moments. But we're gonna set those checks high, yada yada. So, 2 big ogre guards, each with 35 to 75 HP floating range. And if we decide to glance at a stat block for inspiration, we can see that it actually lists both short and ranged weapons for them. So we'll just borrow those. Each ogre is holding a big club in one hand, a throwing javelin in the other. The only things we're really changing are the HP, AC, and the damage they're capable of doing. Then I just go through and write down their saves really quickly. For Intelligence Wisdom, they're going to be really bad at that. That's going to be a -2. Strength and Constitution is going to be great at +3. And then Charisma and Dex is also going to be rough at -1. Proficiency for Strength and Constitution gets a +2 for a total of +5. Boom, done. And here's where we could get a little fancy if we wanted to. We can give them a cool ability that'll either help restrain them or help create difficult terrain for them. So we can either basically give them the grappler feat, or if they do a big stomp move towards the characters, maybe that creates difficult terrain as it breaks up the ground around the PCs, and so on. And I think this is going to be very close range combat, so I'm just going to give them the grappler feat. And then we're just going to finish fleshing out their attacks. The club hits for 3d8 +3, the javelin for 1d8 +3. And that's it. You should really consider trying to run combat this way at least once, because once you understand the basic scaffolding of combat design for your particular group, it makes planning significantly less of a chore, a lot more fun and flowy, and a lot easier to do on the fly. And that first part takes a second. You'll almost definitely have to tweak it in the beginning, so don't be afraid to fudge some rolls, add 10 temp HP if you realize you made an error. The most important part about this style of combat is, after all, the narrative vibe you're looking to bring to this moment. But once you know your PCs and their tendencies, especially as your PC's leveling slows down, those are largely static numbers. So if I'm correct about that HP range for deadly combat, I don't have to adjust that part except to tweak things, usually for the number of enemies. Because say, if these grounds were guarded by a tribe of goblins instead of 2 hulking ogres, we'll need to adjust damage dealt depending on how many goblins are still standing. Or if we have 1 frost giant, it might be more damage dealt but less overall rounds, etc, etc. But yeah, you'll just need to make little tweaks here and there, and then the rest is usually just flavor. You can use pretty much any monster you want for combat once you understand how to change up the vibe a little bit. You don't have to forego using an ooze in high-level battle if it can morph and do cool shit that ups the damage it can deal. Or you don't have to wait for your PCs to reach a certain level before you throw a mana core at them, because that young one can still have the same type of flavor essence you're interested in. Overall, this is just a really fun way of running combat. Again, any books I've recommended I'll link to in the description below. And if you think you'd enjoy running combat this way, you might want to check out this video for other fun tips next.